Pythagoras. You learned his theorem in school. You have said his name 1,000 times. The right angle, the square of the hypotenuse, the elegant little equation that holds the geometry of the universe together. Now here's the thing they never told you in that classroom. The man whose name is on that equation almost certainly never existed, and the people who invented him drowned a colleague for discovering the wrong kind of number. Think about what that means for a moment. The most famous mathematician in the history of Western civilization left behind 0 written words, not a single line, not a formula, not a letter, not a note scratched in the margin of someone else's work. Everything we supposedly know about Pythagoras, his birth around 570 BCE on the island of Samos, his travels to Egypt and Babylon, his school in Croton on the southern coast of Italy, comes entirely from texts written 600 to 1,000 years after he supposedly died. 600 to 1,000 years. That is the distance between us and the Norman conquest of England. Imagine trying to reconstruct someone's biography from sources written that far removed, by writers who openly described their subject as a supernatural miracle worker, because that is what those sources say. The earliest detailed accounts of Pythagoras, written by Porphyry and Iamblichus between 150 and 450 CE, do not describe a philosopher doing math problems at a chalkboard. They describe a figure with a golden thigh, a man who could be in 2 places simultaneously, a prophet whose followers believed he was the reincarnation of the god Apollo himself. One of his most famous alleged abilities was calming aggressive animals with the power of his voice. These are not the biographical details of a mathematician. These are the attributes of an invented god. Now, consider the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's assessment. The total pre-Aristotelian testimony for Pythagoras amounts to roughly 20 brief references, and none of them describe him as a mathematician. The earliest contemporary writers to mention him, Heraclitus and Xenophanes, around 500 BCE, describe a religious figure obsessed with the immortality of the soul. Not geometry, not numbers. The soul. Then there is the theorem itself. The relationship between the sides of a right triangle was documented by Babylonian mathematicians on the clay tablet known as Plimpton 322, which sits today at Columbia University and dates to around 1800 BCE. That is 1,200 years before Pythagoras supposedly discovered it. The Egyptians knew it. The Mesopotamians knew it. The theorem that carries his name was already ancient history by the time his supposed life began. Philosopher Alberto Martinez, in his study The Cult of Pythagoras, argued that there is almost no credible evidence that Pythagoras, even if he existed, contributed anything substantive to mathematics or science. What he may have done, if he was real, is found a secretive religious community in Croton, a group so devoted to him that they attributed every discovery their community ever made directly to the master. The Roman historian Cicero recorded that whenever a Pythagorean was challenged on any point of doctrine, the response was always the same. The master said so. No evidence. No argument, just authority. The cult took that devotion to an extreme. When a member named Hippasus discovered irrational numbers, specifically that the square root of 2 could not be expressed as a fraction, a discovery that threatened the entire theological framework the Pythagoreans had built around the perfection of whole numbers, he was reportedly drowned. Whether that is myth or memory, it captures something real about how the Pythagorean tradition operated. This was not a school of open inquiry. It was a closed religious order protecting a brand. Scholar Simon Critchley put it plainly. It is now almost universally assumed by classical scholars that Pythagoras never existed as an independent historical figure. The Pythagoreans likely invented a founder to legitimize their beliefs, the same way every movement eventually needs a prophet. The theorem wasn't discovered by one man in a flash of insight. It was built slowly, collectively, over generations. And then it was given a name. A golden name. A name that belonged to a man with a golden thigh who could be in two places at once. The most famous equation in history may have no author, and somehow that makes it stranger and more powerful than ever. Because it means the mathematics was real. It was always real. But the man behind it might be the oldest ghost in the archive. From the island of Samos, we cross the Aegean and travel back in time another 200 years to an even older question. The greatest poems in Western literature. Two books that defined what it means to be human. And a single blind poet, claimed by 7 different cities, who may never have picked up a stylus. Homer's 7 cities competed to claim him as their own. 7. Chios, Smyrna, Colophon, Salamis, Rhodes, Argos, Athens, each insisting the greatest poet who ever lived was born within their borders. Think about what that tells you. Not one of them actually knew. Nobody did. And that silence at the center of the most celebrated literary career in the ancient world is the first clue that something here is deeply, structurally strange. The Iliad and the Odyssey are not minor works. They are the foundational texts of Western literature. They shaped Greek religion, Greek warfare, Greek philosophy. They gave us Achilles and Odysseus, Helen and the Trojan horse, the wrath that set civilization itself trembling. For 3,000 years, we have treated these poems as the product of a single visionary mind. A blind bard wandering the Greek world, composing genius from memory, performing for aristocrats and festivals. The problem is that when you go looking for that man, the actual person behind the name, you find almost nothing. Not a grave, not a signature, not a single confirmed biographical fact. Ancient sources don't just disagree on where Homer was born. They disagree on when he lived by over 500 years. The historian Herodotus placed him around 850 BCE. Other ancient authorities pushed him closer to the Trojan War itself, around 1200 BCE. Modern scholarship generally dates the poems to the 8th century BCE, based on linguistic analysis and archaeological cross-referencing with the world they describe. 500 years of disagreement on the dates of history's most famous author is not a minor discrepancy. It is a fire alarm. The classicist Mary Lefkowitz of Wellesley College spent much of her career analyzing the ancient biographies of Homer and concluded that they tell us essentially nothing reliable. The so-called Lives of Homer, she argued in The Lives of the Greek Poets, published in 1981, reflect not history, but the values and imagination of later generations. Every detail, the blindness, the wandering, the divine inspiration, reads as mythology applied to a convenient symbol, not the documented life of a real person. Then there is the structural evidence inside the poems themselves. In the 1930s, the classical scholar Milman Parry spent years doing fieldwork among oral poets in Yugoslavia, watching how epic poetry was composed in performance. What he found transformed Homeric scholarship. Oral epic is fundamentally formulaic. Bards inherit stock phrases, repeated scenes, and memorize story patterns from their predecessors. They compose in performance using these building blocks. When Parry and his student Albert Lord analyzed the Iliad and Odyssey through this lens, the evidence was overwhelming. These poems are saturated with oral formulaic technique. They bear the fingerprints not of a single mind writing in private, but of a tradition performing in public across generations. The poems also contain something a single author should not have produced: language from multiple different Greek dialects and multiple different historical periods layered on top of each other. Weapons and armor from the Mycenaean age sit alongside architectural styles from the 8th century BCE. Scholars have described this as the result of centuries of oral accumulation, each generation of singers updating the story into their own idiom while preserving fragments from older versions. What we have is not a book. It is a coral reef of human memory, built up over centuries, with no single creature responsible for the whole. The philosopher Giambattista Vico reached the same conclusion in 1744. Homer was not a man, but a purely ideal poet who never existed as a particular man. He was an idea, a heroic character of Grecian men insofar as they told their histories in song. The Harvard classicist Gregory Nagy has spent decades building the case that a fixed, canonical Homer text did not exist at all until Alexandrian editors standardized the poems in the 3rd to 1st centuries BCE, meaning the version of Homer we read today was assembled 500 to 800 years after the events it supposedly describes, by scholars who were themselves working from conflicting manuscript traditions. The standard defense is that the poem's internal coherence proves a single organizing genius, and the argument has force. The Iliad is, architecturally, an extraordinary thing, but that coherence could equally reflect a single, decisive editorial mind, working from rich traditional material, not a single composer working from nothing. And the strange, persistent absence of contemporary confirmation, no inscription, no mention in any text written close to his supposed era, no grave that any of the 7 cities could actually produce, keeps pulling the rug. What if Homer is a title, not a name? What if the Homeridae, the guild of professional rhapsodists who performed these poems across the ancient Greek world, eventually needed a founder figure to legitimize their tradition? What if Homer is not the author of the Iliad and Odyssey, but the name given to the tradition that produced them? The most celebrated individual in literary history may be a collective noun, and maybe that is not a loss. Maybe it means these poems belong to all of us in a way they never could if they belonged to one man. From the fog of archaic Greece, we travel south and east, across the sea, into the desert, toward a figure who stands at the foundation of 3 of the world's great religions. A prophet who parted the sea, a lawgiver who spoke with God, a man whose story has been told without interruption for 3,500 years, a man for whom, despite Egypt's obsessive documentation of everything, there is not one confirmed piece of external evidence. Moses Egypt was the most meticulous record-keeping civilization in the ancient world. They documented their pharaohs and their military campaigns. They recorded tax revenues, grain yields, labor disputes, and astronomical observations. They cataloged their defeats, or rather, they didn't, because royal inscriptions never admitted national catastrophe, which is itself a clue. A mass uprising of enslaved people, 10 catastrophic plagues, the destruction of Pharaoh's army in the sea. Events of that scale would have left traces in the Egyptian record. There are none. A century of archaeological work in Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, and Canaan has produced no direct evidence for Moses, no evidence for the mass Israelite captivity as described in Scripture, and no evidence for an exodus involving anything like the numbers the Bible specifies. The archaeologist William Dever, one of the most respected figures in biblical archaeology, described the search for physical proof of the Exodus as, in his words, a fruitless pursuit. The Sinai Peninsula, where 600,000 men, plus women and children, supposedly wandered for 40 years, shows, according to archaeological surveys, almost no sign of occupation during the entire 2nd millennium BCE. Not a campfire ring, not a pottery shard, not a single tool. Tel Aviv University archaeologist Zeev Herzog stated in 1999 that archaeological evidence now suggests the Israelites were never in Egypt, never wandered the desert, and never conquered Canaan in a military campaign. That is not a fringe position. It is, at this point, the archaeological consensus. The earliest Israelite material culture in Canaan is Canaanite in origin. The pottery, the architecture, even the cult objects all trace to Canaanite roots, not Egyptian ones. But here is where the story becomes genuinely strange rather than simply skeptical. Because Moses' birth narrative does not appear to be original. It shares a startling structural identity with a text that predates it by nearly 1,000 years, the legend of Sargon of Akkad, who lived around 2300 BCE. Sargon's birth story records that his mother placed him in a waterproofed reed basket and set him on a river. He was rescued by a stranger, raised outside his origins, and grew to become a legendary king chosen for a divine purpose. The parallels with the Moses narrative are so precise that scholars describe it as a forsaken hero literary template, a story pattern that traveled through ancient Near Eastern oral tradition and was applied, much later, to the figure we know as Moses. Then there is Sigmund Freud's theory, proposed in Moses and Monotheism in 1939, and still seriously engaged by Egyptologists today. Freud argued that Moses was not a Hebrew at all, but an Egyptian priest of the pharaoh Akhenaten, the revolutionary monotheist who worshipped a single sun deity around 1350 BCE. When Akhenaten died and his religious revolution was violently suppressed, Freud proposed that a group of his followers, led by a figure the Egyptians knew by another name, left Egypt with their forbidden theology and became the Israelites. The Egyptologist Jan Assmann of the University of Heidelberg has engaged this theory seriously enough to write multiple books on it, categorizing Moses as a figure of mnemo-history, not verifiable biography, but the distilled memory of a people encoding their deepest traumas and liberations into a single, symbolic life. And there is one more detail that quietly persists in the evidence. The name Moses is Egyptian. So are the names of his closest associates, Phinehas, Hophni, Hur, Hebrew names from Egypt. That is either a remarkable coincidence, or it is a genuine fingerprint. Some scholars now propose a minimalist historical kernel. A small group of Semitic Levites with Egyptian names did have some authentic connection to Egypt during the New Kingdom period, possibly the 13th century BCE. They brought back a story, a theology, and over generations, through retelling and religious pressure, and the needs of a people defining themselves against empire, that story grew into what we have now. The most extraordinary figure in Abrahamic religion may be a composite, a mosaic assembled from the Hyksos expulsion, the Sargon legend, the Akhenaten revolution, and the urgent political theology of Israelite scribes writing in Babylon 7 centuries after the events they described. We may never know if one man stood at the shore and watched the water part. What we know is that 3.5 billion people carry that moment as a memory. And the question of whether the memory is history, or whether it is something more powerful than history, is one that archaeology alone cannot answer. From the deserts of the ancient Near East, we cross 6,000 kilometers east to a different kind of silence. Not the silence of missing evidence, but the silence of a man who supposedly commanded armies, trained kings, and wrote the most read strategy manual in human history, and somehow left no trace in the one historical record that should have caught him. Sun Tzu. The most influential book on strategy in human history is required reading at West Point, at the United States Naval War College, and in the executive suites of the Fortune 500. Its 13 chapters have shaped the military thinking of Mao Zedong, Douglas MacArthur, and Vo Nguyen Giap. It has been cited in courtrooms, boardrooms, and locker rooms. The man who supposedly wrote it has been dead for 2,500 years. And sometime around the 12th century, CE, Chinese scholars began to notice something that has never been satisfactorily explained. The definitive contemporary record of his era does not mention him once. Sun Tzu, born Sun Wu, living supposedly around 544 to 496 BCE in the spring and autumn period, is said to have served as a general for King Hilu of the state of Wu. The Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, writing around 97 BCE, gave us the only substantial biography we have, placing Sun Tzu at the Battle of Boju in 506 BCE, where he supposedly commanded the Wu army to a crushing victory over the far larger state of Chu. The story also includes a famous demonstration. When the king asked Sun Tzu to prove his methods on the royal concubines, Sun Tzu drilled them as soldiers, and when the two favorites laughed at his commands, he had them executed on the spot. The king hired him immediately. The problem is the Zhuozhuan. This is a monumental historical chronicle compiled in the late 4th century BCE, far closer to Sun Tzu's supposed lifetime than Sima Qian's later account. And it provides a remarkably detailed account of that exact battle, the Battle of Boju, describing the Wu army's tactics, its commanders, and the chain of events. Sun Tzu does not appear in it, not as a general, not as an advisor, not as a name. The man who supposedly won the most important victory in Wu history is absent from the most comprehensive contemporary record of that history. Song Dynasty scholar Ye Shi, writing around 1150 to 1223 CE, was among the first to formalize this problem. If Sun Tzu had truly been such a consequential military figure, Ye Shi argued, the Zhuozhuan could not possibly have omitted him. The silence is not an oversight. It is a verdict. The name Sun Wu does not appear in any text prior to Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian. Some scholars have gone further, arguing the name itself is suspicious. That Sun Wu may be an invented descriptive cognomen combining the characters for fugitive and martial, essentially a dramatic pseudonym rather than a birth name. The text itself contains additional problems. The Art of War mentions crossbows and cavalry as standard military technologies, but crossbows and cavalry did not become significant features of Chinese warfare until the Warring States period, which began roughly a century after Sun Tzu's supposed death. The internal evidence of the book suggests it was written, or at minimum substantially revised, long after the man credited with authoring it had supposedly lived. Then, in 1972, construction workers near Linyi in Shandong province accidentally unearthed the Yinkashan Han slips, bamboo texts sealed inside two Han Dynasty tombs between 134 and 118 BCE. Among those texts were two separate military treatises, one attributed to Sun Tzu and another attributed to Sun Bin, who was supposedly his descendant living 100 years later. Both were referred to in classical Chinese texts as Master Sun's Art of War. The discovery did not resolve the mystery. It deepened it. Scholars now believe the two texts represent what one academic summary describes as a single, continuously developing intellectual tradition united under the Sun name, meaning Sun Tzu may be a title or a lineage label, not a single historical individual. Unlike Sun Wu, Sun Bin appears to have been a real, documented person. He was a genuine military authority in the Warring States period, mentioned in contemporary sources. Some researchers now propose that Sun Bin is the historical core, the real strategist, and that Sima Qian, working with fragmentary records 4 centuries after the fact, mistakenly or deliberately projected the tradition back onto an earlier, more heroic founder figure. A process scholars call euhemerism, turning a tradition into a person, giving a school of thought a legendary birth. The strategy worked, in every sense of the word. Whoever wrote those 13 chapters, whether a single genius or 100 soldiers across a century of war, produced something so clear and so universal that it outlasted every kingdom it served. The man may be a ghost. The wisdom is absolutely real. From ancient China, we sail west and north across the centuries, to an island at the edge of the known world, where a different kind of absence waits. Not a general with no biography, but a king with no contemporaries. Britain's once and future ruler. The man who never showed up in his own era's records. King Arthur. The sword drawn from the stone. The round table. The wizard in the dark forest. Camelot rising above the mist. The legend of King Arthur is so complete, so internally consistent, so perfectly calibrated to the human need for a just and noble ruler, that it has survived 1,500 years without thinning. The problem is not that the story is too good, The problem is that nobody who was alive when it supposedly happened seems to have noticed. Arthur is traditionally placed in 5th or 6th century CE Britain, leading the defense against the Saxon invasions following the collapse of Roman authority. This is a period we actually have records for. The monk Gildas, writing around 540 CE, produced a detailed account of the Saxon wars and the British leaders who fought them. He names names. He describes battles. He records atrocities. He does not mention Arthur, not once. The Venerable Bede, writing his comprehensive ecclesiastical history of England around 731 CE, within what would be living memory of Arthur's supposed grandchildren, discusses this entire period in detail. No Arthur. The earliest text to name Arthur is the Historia Brittonum, attributed to a Welsh monk named Nennius, and written around 830 CE, roughly 300 years after Arthur supposedly fought his battles. Nennius lists 12 victories attributed to Arthur, including a final stand at Mount Badon. But the text mixes legend and history so freely that historians treat it as neither fully reliable nor fully dismissible. 300 years of oral transmission before the first written record. That gap is enormous, and it does work. It allows a story to be shaped by the needs of each generation that passed it along. The full Arthur we know today, the Merlin, the Excalibur, the Guinevere, the Knights of the Round Table, appears first in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia, completed around 1138 CE. That is 600 years after Arthur's supposed reign. Geoffrey's own contemporaries were skeptical. The historian William of Newburgh described his work as fabrication, dressed as history. The Round Table itself doesn't appear until the Norman poet Wace's Roman de Brute in 1155 CE Lancelot, the love affair, the Holy Grail. These are all additions from French Romance writers of the 12th and 13th centuries. The legend was not discovered. It was continuously constructed, each generation adding the ideals it most needed to project onto a king from an era nobody could check. No confirmed archaeological site has been identified as Camelot. Excavations at Cadbury Castle in Somerset in the 1960s and 70s, led by archaeologist Leslie Alcock, found evidence of a refortified hilltop settlement from the 5th and 6th centuries, significant and suggestive, but nothing bearing Arthur's name or any direct connection to the legend. The claim that Arthur's grave was discovered at Glastonbury Abbey in 1191 CE is considered by virtually all modern historians to be a forgery. The monks conveniently found it during a fundraising campaign after a major fire destroyed the abbey. The timing was remarkable in exactly the wrong way. Most historians take the position that something real lies beneath the legend. A sub-Roman British war leader, perhaps a cavalry commander, won a significant battle against the Saxons around 500 CE. His memory was preserved in oral tradition, grew across the Dark Ages, and was eventually seized by writers, kings, and propagandists who clothed him in the ideals of their own era. The Normans used Arthur to legitimize their conquest of Britain. The Tudor dynasty invoked him to claim ancient bloodlines. The Victorians deployed him to justify empire. Arthur is not a biography. He is a mirror. And every age that has looked into him has seen exactly what it needed to see. But here is what does not quite resolve. If a real war leader of sufficient greatness fought in 5th century Britain, Gildas would have known about him. Bede would have known. The Annales Cambriae, the Welsh Annals, records one entry possibly referring to him, the Battle of Badon. But Arthur is not named there either. A hero great enough to anchor 6 centuries of escalating legend should have left one confirmed contemporary trace. He left none. From the mists of Britain, we descend into an older and stranger silence. Across the Aegean, into the sun-hammered Peloponnese, to a civilization built on discipline so absolute it bordered on theology. A city that reshaped Western ideas about law and war and sacrifice. and the man who supposedly designed every element of that civilization, a lawgiver so revered the Spartans worshipped him as a god, who may never have existed at all. Lycurgus of Sparta was not built the way other cities were built. It was engineered. Every aspect of Spartan life, the communal dining halls, the iron currency deliberately made too heavy to accumulate, the state-owned children, the professional warrior caste trained from birth, the absolute equality among citizens, the total absence of walls because the soldiers themselves were the walls, was supposedly designed by one man, a single lawgiver who crafted the most radical social experiment in the ancient world. Then, to ensure his laws could never be changed, walked into voluntary exile and starved himself to death. The only problem is that nobody can agree on when he lived, who his parents were, whether he was mortal or divine, or whether he existed at all. The most detailed account of Lycurgus comes from Plutarch's Lives, written around 100 CE. Plutarch opens his Life of Lycurgus with one of the most remarkable confessions in ancient biography. There is, he writes, such profound uncertainty about the man that scarcely anything is asserted by one author which is not contradicted by another. Plutarch is not being modest. He is acknowledging that his primary sources have already collapsed. Different ancient authorities place Lycurgus in different centuries. Some make him a contemporary of Homer around the 9th century BCE. Others place him in the 8th century. Others link him to the earliest Olympic Games at 776 BCE. That is a window of disagreement spanning over 200 years for the man supposedly responsible for one of the most distinctive civilizations in ancient history. The silence behind this becomes more profound when you remember a crucial fact about the Spartans themselves. They deliberately did not write things down. Unlike Athens, which produced an enormous literary and documentary record, Sparta practiced a kind of institutional orality. Their history, their laws, their traditions were preserved through memory and performance, not inscription. This means that almost everything we know about Spartan history comes from outsiders, from Athenians, from later Greeks, from Romans, writing about a culture that never narrated itself. The Lycurgus biography is therefore always at double remove, a tradition without documents, described by people who were not Spartans. Some classical scholars have proposed that Lycurgus was not a person at all, but a function, a name applied to a process. When Spartan culture needed an origin story, when it needed to explain why its radical system existed, why it could not be questioned, why no individual Spartan had the authority to change it, it reached for a founder figure of unimpeachable authority. A lawgiver so ancient, so divinely sanctioned, that his death had locked the Constitution forever. Scholars have noted that Lycurgus's name itself may be significant. It translates roughly as wolf worker, a name that sounds less like a personal name and more like an epithetical title. Some have connected it to the wolf as a symbol of Spartan ferocity. The strategy would not be without precedent. The Catholic Church eventually removed Lycurgus from its calendar of saints and feast days, a remarkable institutional acknowledgement that his historical existence could not be substantiated. What the Spartans built was absolutely real. The agog, the brutal training system that produced the finest soldiers in Greece. The two kings, the 5 ephors, the Council of Elders, a constitutional structure so sophisticated it still draws political analysis. None of it requires Lycurgus to have existed. All of it required his name. There is something quietly vertiginous about this. The most rigorous military culture in Western history, the one that gifted us the idea of the professional soldier and the duty to die for one's city, may have built its entire legal and spiritual foundation on a ghost. A phantom lawgiver who could not be questioned because he could not be found. The laws were real. The discipline was real. The 300 at Thermopylae were real. And the man who made them possible may have been nothing more than a story told so many times it calcified into history. From the iron hills of Sparta, we cross the ancient world eastward, to a philosophy that teaches the exact opposite of Spartan discipline. A wisdom tradition built on yielding, on silence, on the power of emptiness. And a founder whose name is not a name at all, but a description. Laozi Taoism is one of the great spiritual traditions of human civilization. Its central text, the Tao Te Ching, is the most translated book in the world after the Bible. Its insights, that the universe has a natural flow that cannot be forced, that the greatest strength comes from yielding, that the sage who acts without striving achieves what the warrior who strives achieves nothing, have shaped Chinese medicine, martial arts, poetry, governance, and philosophy for 2,500 years. The man who supposedly wrote it is named Laozi. That name translates as Old Master. Not a name, a title. And the historian who gave us our only biography of him essentially admitted in that same biography that he had no idea who Laozi was. The source is Sima Qian, the same Han Dynasty historian who gave us Sun Tzu, writing around 94 BCE, at minimum 400 years after Laozi supposedly lived. In his records of the Grand Historian, Sima Qian does not give us one identity for Laozi. He gives us three. The first is a royal archivist of the Zhou dynasty named Li Er, who supposedly met Confucius and wrote the Tao Te Ching. The second is a different Zhou archivist named Lao Lizi. The third is a historian named Tai Shi Dan, who lived a century later. Then Sima Qian adds, with startling candor, nobody knows which of these is correct, or whether any of them is. This is a historian confessing in his primary source, in real time, that the subject of his biography may not exist. Compare this with Confucius, who is supposed to have been Laozi's younger contemporary around the 5th century BCE. Confucius is exhaustively documented. The Analects record his conversations in detail. His students wrote about him with vivid biographical specificity. Even hostile critics of his era described encounters with him. Laozi, the older, supposedly wiser figure that Confucius reportedly consulted, appears in essentially nothing contemporary. The most famous alleged meeting between them, in which Confucius was so shaken by the encounter that he compared Laozi to a dragon, is found only in texts written centuries after both men supposedly died. Historians treat it as legend. The linguistic evidence adds another layer. Scholars who have analyzed the language of the Tao Te Ching have identified its Chinese as consistent with the 4th century BCE, not the 6th. This either means Laozi lived later than tradition claims, which contradicts the story of his meeting with Confucius, or that the text was composed after its attributed author was long dead, by writers working in a later idiom. The translator D.C. Lao, whose English edition of the Tao Te Ching remains one of the standard scholarly versions, argued in his introduction that the text is almost certainly not the work of a single hand, that its internal variations in style and its occasional contradictions suggest a compiled anthology rather than a single author's meditation. Victor Mayer of the University of Pennsylvania, one of the leading authorities on classical Chinese literature, has argued that the real title of the text should be something like Sayings of the Old Masters, plural, not the sayings of one old man. The word Laozi may have originally designated a class of wise elders, a tradition of anonymous aphoristic wisdom, before it was compressed by later tradition into a single legendary figure who needed a birth date, a biography, and a meeting with Confucius to anchor it in history. And here is the loop that quietly unsettles everything. Taoism teaches that the ideal sage acts without self-assertion, achieves without claiming credit, creates without leaving a trace. The perfect Taoist master, by the philosophy's own logic, should be untraceable. If Laozi genuinely lived by the principles he supposedly taught, the total absence of biographical evidence is not suspicious. It is precisely what you would expect. The mystery of Laozi's identity is, in a deeply strange way, the most Taoist thing about him. He may have disappeared into his own teaching, or there may never have been anyone there to disappear. From a philosopher who dissolved into his philosophy, we cross the mountains and the sea to the city that built Western civilization's template for law, language, and empire, and ask a question Rome's own historians half asked: who actually founded Rome? Romulus Rome was the most consequential city in the history of Western civilization. Its legal system, its political vocabulary, its language, its architecture, all of these still run through the architecture of the modern world. And the story of how it was founded begins with twins, a she-wolf and a fratricidal murder. Romulus killed his brother Remus for jumping over a wall. Then he populated his new city by kidnapping women from a neighboring tribe. Then he vanished in a thunderstorm and became a god. The historians who recorded this story were not primitive. Several of them flagged it directly as legend. The question is how far that label extends. Livy, writing his monumental history of Rome around 27 BCE, opened with one of the most quietly remarkable prefaces in ancient historiography. The earliest stories of Rome, he acknowledged, were more fit for the fictions of poetry than for the authentic records of history. Then he proceeded to record them anyway, because they were what Rome had instead of documentation. The founding date most commonly cited, 753 BCE, was not ancient knowledge. It was a calculation performed by the Roman scholar Marcus Terentius Varro in the 1st century BCE, working backward from a king list to produce a year that felt appropriately ancient. Modern archaeologists believe the settlement of the Palatine Hill began somewhat earlier, around the 9th or 10th centuries BCE, as a gradual process of neighboring Latin and Sabine communities coalescing, not a single founding act by a single man on a specific date. No archaeological evidence has produced anything confirming Romulus as an individual. What excavations of early Rome have revealed is exactly what the gradual coalescence model predicts: overlapping cultural traditions, modest early settlements, slow accumulation of civic identity. The origin myth of divine twins suckled by a wolf has no material correlate. Some historians, including Andrea Carandini of the University of Rome, have argued that the she-wolf story may preserve a garbled memory, that the Latin word lupa, meaning she-wolf, was also common slang for a woman of low social status, suggesting the twins may have been raised by a prostitute or low-born woman rather than an animal, and the story was cleaned up in the retelling. Plutarch, writing his Life of Romulus around 100 CE, compared the founding narrative to similar myths from other cultures, and concluded that even the Romans themselves did not agree on the details. The apotheosis of Romulus, his disappearance during a thunderstorm and transformation into the god Quirinus, was treated skeptically even in antiquity. Livy himself records a version of events in which senators were suspected of tearing Romulus apart and concealing pieces of his body in their robes, and only the timely vision of a senator named Julius Proculus, who claimed to have seen the deified Romulus in a gleaming light, suppressed the scandal. Livy does not fully endorse this version, but the fact that it circulated at all suggests Roman historians were already uncomfortable with the question of whether their founder had really transcended mortality or been quietly disposed of by the people closest to him. The founding myth served a specific and unmistakable political function. Rome needed divine origin to compete with Greek cities that had their own mythological founders, their own divine genealogies. Athens had Theseus. Carthage had Dido. By the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, as Rome's ambitions expanded and its cultural insecurity deepened, the Romulus legend became increasingly elaborate, increasingly useful, increasingly official. Some scholars now argue it was significantly constructed, not just embellished, but substantially invented, during this period, then projected backward to give Rome a divine pedigree older than its ambitions. The city that legislated half the known world may have built its foundation myth on the same raw material it used for everything else. Brilliant engineering and aggressive will. The founder may be fiction. The city was absolutely real. From Rome, we sail north on cold seas, into the age of the longship, toward a hero so famous that television celebrated him for 6 seasons. A legend whose sons are among the best documented Vikings in history, and who himself is nowhere to be found. Ragnar Lothbrok. His name is synonymous with the Viking Age. He raided Paris. He taunted kings. He died laughing in a pit of snakes. He fathered the sons who launched the great heathen army and brought England to its knees. He is the most famous Viking who ever lived. And the scholars who have spent their careers studying the 9th century records of France, England, and Ireland, the contemporaneous documents, the annals written by people who were actually living through the Viking raids, will tell you very quietly that they cannot find him. The primary sources for Ragnar Lothbrok are the Old Norse sagas, principally the Ragnar's saga Lodbrokar, and the Krakumal, his famous death song, sung in the snake pit. These texts were composed in Iceland in the 13th century, roughly 300 to 400 years after Ragnar supposedly died. The historian Saxo Grammaticus included a version of his story in his Gesta Danorum around 1200 CE. These are extraordinary literary documents. They are not contemporaneous records, and the gap between them and the events they describe is wide enough to swallow a fleet. Here is what makes the Ragnar case uniquely strange. His sons are absolutely real. Ivar the Boneless appears in the Annals of Ulster, an Irish chronicle recording events in real time during the 9th century. Björn Ironside is documented in Frankish sources that were written as the raids were happening. Halfdan Ragnarsson is named in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as a Danish king during the invasions of the 860s and 870s. Sigurd's snake in the eye is referenced in multiple Scandinavian sources. 4 sons, confirmed in contemporary records from 4 different regions. The family is real. The father is not there. The great heathen army that descended on England in 865 CE is one of the most consequential military events in English history. It ended the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. It produced the Danelaw. The later sagas attribute it entirely to revenge for Ragnar's death in the snake pit of the Northumbrian king Ella. But the contemporary sources, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Frankish Annals, the Irish records, give different, more complex motivations. And not one of them describes a previous king named Ragnar, whose death triggered anything. The snake pit story does not appear in any 9th century document. It first appears centuries later in Norse literary tradition as a retrospective explanation for events that contemporaries recorded with different causes entirely. Neil Price of Uppsala University, one of the world's foremost scholars of the Viking Age, has described Ragnar as a legendary figure around whom real historical events clustered. The most plausible explanation, Price and others have argued, is that Ragnar is a composite. Multiple real 9th century Danish and Norwegian chieftains, raiders who operated from different kingdoms, who raided different targets, whose individual stories were preserved in scattered fragments of oral tradition, were gradually merged in the cultural memory of Scandinavia into a single superhero ancestor, the greatest Viking, the father of all the great sons, a figure whose invented biography unified what was actually a diffuse and fractious age of competing warbands. The name Lothbrok means hairy breeches. Most scholars consider it a descriptive nickname or epithetical addition, which further suggests the character is assembled rather than biographical. Real people rarely acquire animal hide-based epithets that survive across centuries, unless the epithet is doing literary work rather than biographical work. And yet here is what remains genuinely troubling. If 4 of Ragnar's sons left such clear contemporary traces that survive in documents from 4 different countries, then their father's raids should also be traceable. The Frankish annals describe a Viking leader raiding the Seine Valley in 845 CE, who is sometimes cautiously identified as a possible historical Ragnar, but the Franks call him Regan. Whether that is the same person as the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, or just a convenient candidate onto whom the legend was later projected, is a question that cannot currently be answered. The sons are documented. The father is smoke. From the northern seas, we come to our final entry, a figure who was neither real nor forgotten, a man who never drew a breath, who nonetheless commanded the loyalty of popes, the strategy of crusading armies, the course of global exploration for 400 years. The most consequential, non-existent person in the history of geopolitics. Prester John, imagine a letter arriving at the court of the Pope in Rome. The year is 1165. The letter comes from a Christian king of unimaginable wealth. He rules 72 kingdoms. His palace is built of pure crystal and precious stone. His realm contains the fountain of youth, rivers that run with gems, and 72 vassal kings who eat at his table and serve at his pleasure. He is a descendant of the Magi. He is a protector of Christians everywhere, and he is offering to march his armies westward to attack the Islamic kingdoms from the east while the Crusaders attack from the west, and together they will liberate the Holy Land. European kings and popes spent the next 400 years trying to find him. He did not exist. The first written reference to Prester John appears in the chronicle of Bishop Otto of Freising, written in 1145 CE. Otto reported hearing from a Syrian bishop about a Nestorian Christian king in the Far East who had recently defeated the Persians and Medes and was moving toward the Crusader states. Otto described this as second-hand information. 20 years later, the letter of Prester John appeared, a document addressed to the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Comnenus and copied immediately across Europe, landing in the hands of Pope Alexander III, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and the courts of a dozen kingdoms. The letter circulated in over 100 manuscript copies. Modern scholars, including Vsevolod Slesarev in his study Prester John, the letter and the legend have concluded it was a deliberate literary forgery, almost certainly composed in Europe by a writer with geopolitical ambitions. The author has never been conclusively identified. Pope Alexander III took it seriously enough to write back. In 1177 CE, he composed an actual papal letter addressed to the illustrious King of the Indies, the most holy Prester John, and dispatched it with his personal physician as an envoy. The physician set out and was never heard from again. The Pope had sent a diplomatic mission to a fictional kingdom. Marco Polo, traveling through Central Asia in the 1270s, searched for Prester John and eventually decided that a Nestorian Christian tribal leader called Wang Khan, who had been defeated and killed by Genghis Khan decades earlier, was probably the basis of the legend. This was essentially an admission that the real Prester John could not be found, and the best available substitute had already been dead for a generation. The legend then migrated. As Portuguese explorers pushed down the coast of Africa in the 15th century, motivated partly by the genuine strategic hope of finding a powerful Christian ally to outflank the Islamic world, they arrived in Ethiopia, a Christian kingdom, and immediately declared it Prester John's realm. The explorer Pero de Covilhã was sent to Ethiopia in 1487 CE, specifically on this mission. Portuguese-Ethiopian diplomatic relations for the next 2 centuries were shaped in part by a fiction. The legend's geography shifted 3 times across 400 years, from Central Asia to India to Ethiopia. It always located itself just beyond the horizon of the known world, retreating as European maps improved. This is not how real kingdoms behave. Real kingdoms stay put. This is exactly how an invented kingdom behaves. It moves because it must, because the moment it can be checked, it fails. Historian Charles Beckingham of the School of Oriental and African Studies spent much of his scholarly career documenting the Prester John legend and concluded that it was one of the most consequential fictions in the history of exploration, directly shaping Portuguese maritime strategy and contributing to the decisions that produced the Age of Discovery. Expeditions were launched, oceans were crossed, trade routes were opened, colonial relationships were established, all partly because powerful men in Europe believed in a king who was writing letters from a crystal palace he had never built. The letter itself, if you read it, is not subtle in its fantasy. Fountains of youth, rivers of gems, 72 kings at dinner. These are not the details of a plausible geopolitical briefing. They are the details of a wish, a dream of rescue dressed up in royal correspondence. And yet the dream worked. It drove real ships across real oceans. A man who never existed shaped the modern world in ways that many men who did exist never managed, which is, perhaps, the most disturbing thing on this list. Look at what 10 entries have produced. A mathematician whose theorem predates him by 1,200 years. A poet whose 7 competing homelands prove that nobody actually knew where he came from. A prophet who left no trace in the records of the civilization he supposedly upended. A general whose own era's most authoritative history forgot to mention him. A king whose full biography wasn't written until 6 centuries after his supposed reign. A lawgiver whose dates no ancient source can agree on. A philosopher whose own historian admitted he might be 3 different people. A founder whose city's origin story was probably assembled centuries after the founding. A hero whose sons are confirmed and who is himself absent. And a king whose fictional letters redirected the course of global exploration. The standard academic response to every one of these cases is the same, probably based on something real. A kernel, a historical core, a real person whose story grew in the telling. And that response deserves respect, because it is often right. Oral traditions do preserve genuine events. Legends do carry fragments of authentic memory. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, and any honest archaeologist will say so first. But here is what that explanation does not account for. Why these particular people? Why did the ancient world, across Greece, China, Egypt, Rome, Britain, Scandinavia, and the Near East so consistently attach its most transformative ideas to figures who resist verification? The theorem that anchors geometry, the epics that define literature, the strategy manual that shaped warfare, the philosophy that became a world religion, the laws that built an empire, all attributed to people who cannot be confirmed. That is not random. That is a pattern. And the pattern suggests something that mainstream scholarship tends to sidestep. The most powerful ideas in human history may be precisely the ones that cannot be owned by any single challengeable, biographical, mortal human being. An idea with an author can be argued with. An idea with a ghost for an author cannot. Most people encounter these names in school, absorb the textbook biography, and move on. They accept the portrait without asking who painted it, or when, or why. You didn't do that. You followed the evidence to the edge of what can be confirmed, and kept looking. That is not a common habit. This channel exists for the people who cannot make themselves stop looking. If that is you, hit subscribe and stay in the archive. And go to the comments right now with one answer. Of these 10 figures, which one disturbs you most? Not the most famous, not the most mysterious. The one whose absence, if confirmed, would most completely change how you see the world that was supposedly built in their name. The floor is yours. Here's what stays with you. These figures built the architecture of human civilization. Our science, our literature, our laws, our faiths, our wars. And some of them may never have drawn a single breath, which means the most powerful force in human history is not fire or steel or empire. It is a story that needs no author to outlive every person who ever told it. The theorem still holds. The poems still move. The philosophy still points. Something built all of that. Maybe it was one man. Maybe it was 10,000 people across 1,000 years reaching for the same truth through the dark. Subscribe and keep asking the question.